Reform and Culture, 1790 to 1860. The Second Great Awakening. The state of American Revolution in the early 18th century, about 75% of the 23 million Americans attended church regularly. Many churchgoers had become more liberal in their thinking. Rationalist or Enlightenment ideas of the French Revolution era had softened the older orthodoxy. Deism, which was promoted by Paine and influenced by Jefferson, Franklin, and others, was also rooted in the spirit of Enlightenment. It relied heavily on reason rather than revelation, on science rather than the Bible. It rejected the concept of original sin and denied the divinity of Christ. It believed in a supreme being who created a knowable universe and endowed human beings with the capacity for moral behavior. So the deists have this idea of the great clock builder or watchmaker that built everything and then stepped away to let humans handle it. Deism inspired an important spin-off from severe Puritanism, Unitarianism. Unitarianism is that God exists in only one person and not the Orthodox Trinity. So it denies the Catholic idea of the Holy Trinity. It stressed the essential goodness of human nature rather than the evilness of human nature, that free will and salvation through good works, that God was a loving Father and not a stern creator. The Unitarian faith was embraced by intellectuals like Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose rationalism and optimism contrasted with the hellfire Calvinist doctrines, especially those of predestination and human depravity. The impact of the Second Great Awakening. It's a reaction against growing liberalism, deism, Unitarianism in religion around 1800. So the Second Great Awakening is a reaction to these new liberal religious ideas. And it begins on the southern frontier, but it would soon spread to northern cities. It's one of the most momentous episodes in the history of American religion. It influences far more people than the First Great Awakening and will lead to a lot of reform movements that take place during the time period. The effects of the Second Great Awakening, it converted countless people, shattered and reorganized churches and new sects, fostered new reform movements such as the prison reform movement, the temperance movement, the women's movement, and the abolitionist movement. It spread to the masses on the frontier through huge camp meetings. As many as 25,000 persons would gather for several days to hear Hellfire Gospel. The Methodists and Baptists benefited most from this religious revivalism. Both sects stressed personal conversion, which is contrary to predestination. Relatively democratic control of church affairs came about as a result of the Second Great Awakening. And there's a stress of emotionalism. Peter Cartwright was probably the best known of the Methodist circuit riders or traveling preachers. Charles Grandison Finney was the greatest of the revivalist preachers. He believed in earthly perfectionism, a Puritan strain of thought. He helped inspire major reform movements in education, temperance, which is cutting out of alcohol, or at least reducing the use of alcohol, and abolitionism, the end of slavery, or the abolition of slavery. Denominational diversity, the Burned Over District in western New York. Many New England Puritans had settled in western New York, and the region became known for its hellfire and damnation sermons. The Adventists, or the Millerites, grew to several 100,000 adherents. They're led by William Miller, who interpreted the Bible to mean that Christ would return on October 22nd, 1844. Oops, I think he was wrong. So the failure of Christ to appear dampened but did not destroy the movement. People still followed Miller, even though his prediction of Christ returning October 22nd, 1844 wasn't true. I guess he forgot to carry a decimal. All right, the divisions within religion. Wealthier, better educated levels of society were not as affected by religious revivalism. Those groups were the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, and the Unitarians. The less prosperous, less learned, or less educated communities in the rural South and the West were most affected by revivalism. They were the Methodists, the Baptists, and other sects. The slavery issue would end up splitting the Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians along sectional lines. Secession of Southern churches foreshadowed the secession of Southern states. So there's actually a break in some of the Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches along sectional lines, which is similar to the break that's going to take place in the country overall. The Mormons, Joseph Smith founded the Church of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, in 1830 and wrote the Book of Mormon after claiming to have experienced a revelation. The Church of Latter-day Saints is founded in the Burned-Over district in western New York. The Mormons became persecuted, and so they traveled west. They're persecuted in Ohio, then in Missouri, then in Illinois. The cooperative nature of the religion offended many individualistic Americans. There were also accusations of polygamy, especially once Joseph Smith takes over, and that increases opposition to the Mormons. Now, polygamy did exist, and for the most part, it was likely a survival strategy used by the Mormons as a small and persecuted religion that needed to grow in number because there's power in numbers. What better way to increase in size than by increasing your own population naturally as fast as possible? So the Mormons faced persecution. They continued to move west, and in 1844, Joseph Smith and his brother are murdered and mangled by a mob in Illinois. So Brigham Young will lead the Mormons to Salt Lake City, Utah in 1846 and 1847. The community at Salt Lake became a prosperous frontier theocracy, or religious-based government, and a cooperative commonwealth. They were able to cultivate the semi-arid Utah region by ingenious and cooperative methods of irrigation. In 1857, the Federal Army marched against the Mormons, and the Mormons were willing to die for their cause, and the crisis ends without any serious bloodshed. The Mormons later flouted anti-polygamy laws passed by Congress in 1862 and 1882, and statehood was delayed until 1896 as a result of their unique marital customs. At the Second Great Awakening and the Age of Reform, most reforms were driven by evangelical religion in the Second Great Awakening. Many of these modern idealists dreamed anew the old Puritan vision of a perfect society in America. Many desired to reaffirm traditional values as society had plunged into a more complex world of transforming market economy. Women, particularly prominent in the Reform Crusades, especially in their struggle for suffrage or the right to vote. The movements offered many middle-class women opportunities to escape the confines of home and enter into public affairs. Major reform issues that come out of the Second Great Awakening are the abolition of slavery, and that will overshadow all of the other reform movements. Temperance, or the reduction of use of alcohol, or the abolition or end of use of alcohol. The women's rights movement, education reform, the ending of war, providing better conditions for the mentally ill, prison reform, a push for reformatories rather than punitive institutions, and ending imprisonment for debt, or ending debtors' prisons.